What's new?
I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Hebrew Theological College and Touro College. I'm with Sandra Fox. She is the Jim Joseph Postdoctoral Fellow in Education and Religion at Stanford University, and I think to date, probably the foremost scholar in Jewish camping. And that isn't to say that there hasn't been a field of Jewish camping. There are articles and books, and camping has entered into the literature of American Jewish history. But Sandy, what you've done is taken camping at full depth. You've understood you've understood camping as a cultural incubator of Jewish life. And even though we can't, especially in the first decades of the 20th century, we can't speak about or maybe at all, rigid movements of a Yiddish movement or a Zionist movement or a reform movement or a conservative movement. Yes, camping was institutionalized in certain spheres, but what you're looking at is really how summer camping becomes an incubator of cultural experiences, and for that, movements as well.
Well, thanks for that introduction. For me, I guess the inspiration for this project was partly my own experience growing up in summer camp, but it was also that for a number of years, even before my doctorate, I was really interested in this field, this kind of small social history field of history of childhood and youth. So looking at American Jewish history through the lens of youth, not just in terms of what adult educators want youth to be, but also what youth create by the nature of their own culture, their own desires, their own interests. So my approach to the study of camps is kind of looking at those two dynamics, the top down and the bottom up at all turns. And also what you pointed out about kind of looking at it from these broad movements. I mean, I could make it even broader. You know, there were other camps besides conservative, reform, Yiddishist and Zionist. It's tough. You know, once you go that big, it's almost like, why didn't you go to all the camps? But you can't, talk, concisely or necessarily smartly about all camps in one breath, because there's so much diversity there. But I did think that these four different kinds of camps, first of all, Yiddishist camps don't get treated at all practically in the literature. Very little said about them. Nothing said about them in the post-war period, as if they evaporated into thin air after the Holocaust, which is not true. And then the literature that is out there, which is very good research, has mostly looked at these camps as individual movements or as individual camps. And that's very valuable. There's obviously advantages to doing that, right? You can make almost broader statements and arguments because you're talking about something so much more definable. But I thought that as I looked at camp archives, what was most interesting was how similar they were. That these ideologies that people think of as at odds with each other, right? Zionism and Yiddishism, for instance, we don't think about those things typically as one and the same. They're kind of ideological constructs that are meant to be pitted against each other. Yeah, they're oppositional. They're meant to be pitted against each other. So looking at the camp side by side and saying, God, but on every other level, is this experience not nearly the same? And kind of replacing one cultural paradigm with another. So that's what's been really interesting about studying such a wide range of camps, is just seeing the ways they take the same kind of elements of camp life and apply it or infuse it with their own ideologies.
Why is it that all of these different movements or different thought and educational leaders, why are they seizing on the camping experience in this period, in the 20th century?
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, it's worth saying that I study the post-war period primarily, but summer camping predates the post-war period. So why is the post-war period interesting versus those other periods? In the early 20th century, American Jews were very enthusiastic consumers of summer camps of all different kinds. Private camps for kind of middle class and I guess aspiringly middle class Jews, philanthropic camps for more recent immigrants, the children of immigrant families, and all sorts of camps. And there's beginnings there of educational Jewish camping. You see some early Hebraist summer camps like Camp Achva ran by Samson Benderly. You see Camp Sedgwin pretty early on, which was from the Central Jewish Institute. And the Yiddish Volksschule and the Yiddish schools also established a lot of camps in the 1920s. But in the post-war period, you kind of have this confluence of factors. You have the aftermath of the Holocaust, the kind of rise of the American Jewish middle class, growing affluence, socioeconomic mobility, and suburbanization. And Jewish communal leaders of all these different types see that essentially something is lacking in American Jewish education, and that something can be fulfilled in the summer camp by the nature of its, totalizing, immersive characteristics. That if you take kids away from their parents, who are also, according to these leaders, at fault for the sort of lack of authenticity in American Jewish culture, when you take them away from their parents and their schools and mainstream popular culture, you can change them. You can make them into the kinds of Jews that you think are real or ideal or authentic or just better than American Jewry at the time. So camps are considered to be this really powerful panacea for all these communal ills caused by comfort, basically. Of course, the irony is these camps, they might be rustic compared to some other American camps at the time, but they're not necessarily rustic anymore. There's a modernization process that happens from the early 20th century onward, where you have bunks and spaces that are kind of, built up, but still this idea that you can transform these comfortable suburban, largely middle-class American Jews into better Jews by immersing them in Jewish life.
Are other American groups also looking at summer camp for that ability to spirit the children away from their comfortable environments? Is that something that other people are doing as well?
In the post-war period, not that I can tell. In the early 20th century, you have all sorts of groups using camps for all sorts of social missions. So you have like Christian groups with this notion of muscular Christianity. You have progressive reformers with ideas of how like urbanization and industrialization are weakening men and leading girls astray. And so camps are supposed to take them out of those, the urban smut and create these better, healthier American children. But in terms of the post-war period, and again, it's tough because unfortunately, I wish there was, but there is no book equivalent. So there's a great book called Children's Nature, which is about the early 20th century American summer camping. Includes Jewish camps, but it's a much broader picture. Wonderful book by a historian named Leslie Paris. There's no companion book about the post-war period. So I get asked a lot, what were other American camps like? And I have impressions from my research from things like the American Camping Association and directors groups and different things, but ultimately, unfortunately, there's not this kind of comparative lens that I can so easily do. Maybe another book at another time. But I do think that there is something unique about Jewish camping in the amount that that communal leaders really invested in it, believed in it. When I spoke to this scholar named Jacob Swordson, who's a scholar of Christian summer camping, although primarily contemporary. So he's done some historical research, but he primarily studies them today. It was very clear that Christian summer camping is very important to those who go to Christian summer camp, but it's by no means holds the kind of cultural weight that it does in the American Jewish community of, oh, where did you go to camp? And almost an assumption among certain kinds of Jews that camp was in the background of your life. It's not necessarily like that. And those camps tend to be more recreational than educational. So there's not exactly a direct comparison. There are Muslim summer camps, but they're a much more recent phenomenon, and it'd be super interesting to read some more research on that down the line.
Now, summer camp is both for the campers and the counselors, right? So you see so many people in positions of Jewish leadership, particularly in the post-war period, who are alumni, not just as campers, but as counselors. They developed their leadership toolbox in these camps. When I think about summer camp, I think about, yes, cultivation of culture, yes, socialization and education, but I also think about it as a leadership training ground. And so much attention is paid, not just to the campers, but to the counselors as well.
Yeah. In terms of what you're saying about counselors, that is true, that the counselor experience is a leadership experience and very, very important. But I think that I think it would be fair to say that the focus on counselors is a newer phenomenon. By the end of my period, by the 60s, 70s, you do start to see that. But in the earlier periods, counselors were kind of picked up from recruiting them on college campuses. They didn't necessarily have a connection to the camp. You know, there was a lot more of an economic issue of like who was going to spend their college summers working at camp for barely any money. So it also requires that affluence that still gets, you know, it begins in the 40s and 50s, but really gets kicked into high gear in the 60s. So I do think that you know, the idea that I think is really prevalent in American Jewish education today, and certainly rings true to my own experience being a camper and a counselor at camp, is that camp is for the counselors. I think that that's sort of a lens that comes from the present and recent past more so than the beginning of the post-war period. However, it is really true that especially, I mean, there are certain camps that highlighted leadership training both for older campers and for counselors. So like Zionist summer camps are incredibly focused on notions of peer leadership, and that begins at the camper level, but follows for sure through the counselor level. And they also created all these, you know, counselor and training programs, which on the one hand were a way to keep people in the pipeline, keep kids in the pipeline, like keep coming back to camp, and a little bit more money for the camp. But then it does lead them into being the counselor role. So you see more of those sorts of programs also in the 60s. Again, when sending your kid to summer camp at 17 didn't sound as crazy because the economic imperative for them to get a summer job was less. So yeah, counselors are super essential. They also happen to be kind of the missing piece in the archives sometimes, actually. I mean, you would think campers are the most silent in the archives because of their age, but there are documents written by campers, like camp newspapers and all sorts of little things that you find in the archives, letters that ended up, you know, sent to parents, then sent back to the camp. Why is my kid unhappy? Or, you know, these sorts of things. The thing that's challenging but also exciting to me about the topic is that people created content at camp. Could be counselors, it could be older campers, it could be adult Jewish educators, and no one wrote their names on it. I mean, very rarely do I encounter an activity or a curriculum or a skit with an author. So I'm sure one of the criticisms of my book one day was that I'll just I keep talking about educators, like this broad category that could be like any of those things. It could be a 16-year-old CAT and an 18-year-old counselor or a 30-year-old rabbi. And I just don't know. And I think that's what's great about it. It's like a democratized site. And that really excites me as, you know, a social historian who's interested in the bottom up as well as the top down.
What about the language that is used in some of these activity guides? Whether is it a night tochnit? Is it a night seder? Is it a night program, an evening program? What about the language that's employed or deployed in these camping settings?
Right. So there's a lot of overlaps, which is super interesting, but also a lot of differences. So obviously on the Yiddish front, the Yiddish camps, just like the kind of Hebrew infused camps, used Yiddish words for parts of the camp area or groups or times on the schedule. So you'd have like, what's a good example? I like the flag raising area is the Chaverschaftsplatz, the friendship or comradeship place or area, and you have a lot of uniformity across the Hebrew kind of Zionist camps. So you do have Jewish languages infusing the language of camp, but you're definitely right that there are these creative names, and it's pretty interesting. You know, did a camp use Pulat Erev or did they create a different word? And yeah. So language is a huge piece of it. Some camps attempted to be, entirely Hebrew speaking or entirely Yiddish speaking, and campers with their own ideas and interests and desires could get in the way of that. You could look at that as an educational failure, or you can look at that as camper culture responding and saying, this doesn't click for us. We live in America. Why are you trying to get us to speak a foreign language we don't speak?
So one area that's really not covered, because we've relied on newspaper articles, we haven't actually done what you've done, which is to go into the camping archives themselves, is to get a better handle on the relationships between campers. These social networks that are formed are these bonds within these Yiddish camps, Zionist camps, denominational camps. Those relationships are crucially important, not just to the campers, as every summer they get to see their friends again. Remember, their long distance phone calls were quite expensive. We get to see how they develop those relationships, and maybe also, and especially in most of these camps, of course, are coeducational, they get to find romantic relationships, which of course would be endogamous.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of the most interesting parts for me in terms of looking at the top down and the bottom up. Camp directors did not often write, in their materials, we are creating this camp so that kids will meet the opposite sex, and that will, connect them to the Jewish people forever because they will marry other Jews because of the wonderful time they had at camp with boyfriend or girlfriend so-and-so. However, what you see among Jewish camps, first of all, again, tough to make broad claims about this because of the lack of, a companion book about broader American camping, but it does seem pretty clear from the research that Jews did embrace coeducational camping more quickly and more perhaps vociferously than people of other groups, ethnic groups or religious groups. And that's even true of Orthodox camping, right? I mean, many Orthodox camps began single sex in the, let's say, 20s, 30s, 40s, but by the 50s and 60s, plenty of them were coeducational. And that in and of itself is interesting. And what I can kind of say about that is that, from pretty early onward in the camping project, there is this idea of this is a place where, children, especially older children, adolescents, can meet potentially their future husband or wife. And if not their future husband or wife, at least have an experience that gives them the value of, I want something similar. I want a Jewish person in my life. And as intermarriage anxiety increases in the American Jewish community, particularly in the late 60s and 70s, and then beyond, right, into today, that concern about that rising rate becomes like ever more explicit and ever more present in summer camping. And so what I like to look at is the kind of interesting dance between the goals of camp directors, educators, leaders, and the interests and desires of campers who do, they're teenagers or they're preteens, and they're arriving with hormones, they're arriving with interests in the opposite sex largely in this period, right? Like not a lot of conversation about same-sex relationships at this time. And those separate goals, dynamics, and interests do mix and mingle within camp life to make romance and sexuality really front and center in the experience for a lot of campers. So while, the scholar of Christian camping I mentioned earlier said that in Christian camps, there's no, encouragement of romantic or sexual relationships. In Jewish camps, there's sometimes encouragement, sometimes just ambivalence or the turning of the other cheek to what is going on, or creating times in the schedule that allow that kind of romantic atmosphere to come to fruition. So when I talk to former campers, of course, their experience of it is not about intermarriage. It's not about what the staff members wanted. To them, it was all this kind of separate camper culture thing that was, completely theirs. It had nothing to do with the staff. But then when you think about camps as spatially and organized and organized in terms of the schedule, you see that there are these times in the schedule that are created: camp dances, banquets, dating kind of games and activities, simulated marriage ceremonies, sexual education sometimes, education about Jewish marriage sometimes. That the counselors and the older staff members are also creating that atmosphere. I think one of the more interesting things is most camps didn't have a name for it, but there was usually a period of time between the end of the last activity and lights out where you walked back to your bunk unattended by counselors, and it seems like it was pretty much accepted that was a moment for couples to go off on their own and find privacy in the dark. And what's interesting is that seems like that was the case in the 40s and 50s just as much as the 60s and 70s, which, you know, calls the sexual revolution, you know, our ideas about the sexual revolution into question. But it's very interesting to hear, especially from former campers, because that was one area of camp life that the archives were just simply not enough. Like you couldn't rely on them alone.
Amazing.
Although there was a lot in there too.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.